How many people do you know who'd like to drive a train? Well, although they may not admit it, I'm sure they'd love to be sitting where I'm sitting, because I'm in the driving seat of a legend. This is the fastest steam locomotive in the world, and her name? Mallard. Mallard is just one of over 100 locomotives in the care of the National Railway Museum, and at any one time you'll find 60 or so here in York, together with coaches and clocks, tickets and timetables, in fact all the paraphernalia that go to make the railway what it is. And for many people that's much more than simply a mode of transport. It's a fascinating and irreplaceable part of our heritage. And since its emergence in the early years of the 19th century, railways have changed not only Britain, but the whole world. The museum, the NRM as it's known to its friends, attracts over 420,000 visitors each year. From the earliest days of the railway pioneers to the very latest in modern technology, there's something here for everyone. And with many of the special exhibitions changing on a regular basis, you can come back again and again and still find something new. Over the next 65 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on a tour of the museum to see some of its finest exhibits. And we'll also be looking behind the scenes at some things visitors don't normally get the chance to see. So, let's start with the steam locomotives, and the oldest in the museum, the Agenoria. This strange-looking machine was built in 1829 and worked at the Shut End Colliery in Staffordshire, hauling coal trucks from the pithead to the nearby canal at a leisurely walking pace. Its design is typical of locomotives in the early 19th century, but just look at this complicated array of levers and rods required to transfer the power from the vertical piston down to the wheels. And, taking a look at the boiler, you can see that it's just a large cylinder with a single flue running through the water space. It's not a very efficient method of producing steam. However, despite the limitations caused by its design, the Agenoria worked quite successfully at the colliery for over 35 years. Built in the same year as the Agenoria was a locomotive destined for immortality. Rocket. The two locos offer a fascinating contrast in design. Although the original Rocket has survived, this section replica is very useful in its own way to demonstrate why Rocket was such a major turning point in railway history. Rocket's original design incorporated three new ideas which had never before been tried together, and it was this combination that revolutionised the power and performance of steam locomotives. The first innovation was to do away with the complicated rods and levers of the Agenoria. Instead, the driving force of the piston was linked by means of a single shaft down to the driving wheel. And the second major advance, though less obvious, was just as important. Looking inside the firebox, easy to do in this section replica, you can see a number of small tubes. Now these tubes, in common with the Agenoria's single large tube, were responsible for taking the hot gases from the locomotive's fire through the water-filled boiler. And when you've got a lot of tubes, you've got a dramatic increase in the heated surface area, which results in a far higher rate of steam production. The third and final innovation was all to do with the use of the exhaust steam. Now in the early locomotives, the exhaust steam from the cylinder was simply released into the atmosphere, and like a car with no silencer, this was very inefficient and also very noisy. Well, the problem was overcome by diverting the steam out up through the chimney. But the designers of Rocket also realised that they could harness this exhaust steam, further improving the efficiency of the locomotive. And this was done by directing the steam through a narrowing pipe, or blast pipe, in the base of the chimney. The blast pipe had the effect of creating a strong draft at the end of the boiler tubes that in turn drew hot gases from the fire through the tubes, increasing the boiler's ability to produce steam. So, the harder the locomotive worked, the more hot gases were drawn through the boiler, more steam was produced, and the harder the locomotive could work. And it really did work. This is the museum's working replica of Rocket, and it's steamed up regularly for museum visitors. Well, my driver today, well, I'm lucky to have with me Richard Gibbon, the head of engineering here at the NRM. So take her away, Richard. Well, that was a very exhilarating experience, even if it's only going at 10 miles an hour. Isn't that brilliant, Richard?
Yes, it's a fine machine. And the important thing about this, Lucy, is that it's these three principles that occurred for the very first time in Rocket, the inclined cylinders, the multitubular boiler and the blast pipe, were worked on for the next 140 years to develop the steam locomotive to the middle of the 20th century, by which time it had become a finely perfected machine. Follow me back into the museum and let's go and have a look at one.
Fantastic.
Okay, so here we are, the very heart of the matter. We're in the firebox of the final development of the British steam locomotive. This is a mid-20th century steam locomotive which has been cut in half, and we can see all the things that we learned about on Rocket. I'm standing actually in the firebox where the coal burns to produce the heat. The firebox is a square room about the size of a small kitchen, and it's surrounded by water here at the sides, over the roof here, down the front, and on the floor here we have fire bars, and the coal is thrown through by the firemen from the tender onto the fire bars, and as the air comes up through underneath, the fire burns and produces flames which come up and through all these tubes which we see at the front of the firebox. These tubes are surrounded by water, and like the elements in a kettle, as the flames go through the tubes, so the heat is given up to the water and the steam collects in the space above. We're going to go through into the boiler now so that we can explain that in more detail. Here are the tubes that we saw coming out of the firebox. I'm standing here now inside this giant kettle, which of course wouldn't be possible when the locomotive was in steam. We've got a water level at this point here, and the fire is coming through these 200 tubes and passing forwards to the front end. Here is the highest point on the boiler. This is called the dome, and inside the dome there is a large tap called a regulator, which the driver has control of. Being a kettle, but a kettle with the lid firmly jammed on, the steam is accumulating in this space up here. And when the driver wants to make the engine go, he operates this large tap, and the steam is taken from the highest point on the boiler and fed forward to the front of the engine, to the cylinders where all the work's done. Right, here we are in the smoke box of the locomotive. This is where all the hot gases end up coming through those tubes we saw earlier. The steam that the driver has allowed to come through from the top of the boiler is fed into a manifold at the front here, and after the steam has been back to the fire to be reheated, it's gathered together and distributed to the three cylinders through these three steam pipes. The steam is shown in the pink colour here, and the high pressure, high temperature steam is taken down to the cylinders. The hot gases in the meantime come through the tubes, having done their work, and then up through the chimney, which is sitting on top of the smoke box here. Here we are at the cylinders where the steam is, the energy in the steam is converted into mechanical work. And remember that the steam comes down the pink pipes, and what we've got in this area here is a main power piston working in a cylinder down here and a distribution valve up here which directs the steam. And if you watch very carefully, we can follow the path of the steam and explain exactly what happens. Watch very carefully at this point here. The steam in this chamber, as this valve goes back, suddenly has the chance to fly down this channel, get behind the piston and push it. As it pushes down through this drive line, just like a pedal car, it pushes the wheel backwards. Then, at the other end of the stroke, we've got steam here also, and the steam rushes down this channel and pushes the piston back, which then pulls the wheel forwards. Watch very carefully now again at this end. The steam comes down the channel, ready, now. The steam is now in here, connected to the boiler, pushing like mad against this piston. Watch the valve close now, the steam cuts off, the steam is now trapped in here under pressure, and now, suddenly, as the valve goes forward, can escape up through here and up the chimney with the chuff that we all know is the sound that the steam locomotive makes. As the steam goes up through the chimney, so it entrains the gases that we talked about earlier up here. And the gases, the hot gases from the fire are drawn through the tubes, and the only way that that can be replaced is by fresh air coming in under the fire bars, which is where we started. As the fresh air comes in underneath, it brings the fire to life. So as that chuff from this steam goes out through the chimney, so the fire comes to life, and it physically picks up off the fire bars and lifts as it's brought to life. So we've covered the cylinders, we've covered the blast pipe, and we've covered the multitubular boiler, the three features that occurred in Rocket all those years ago that made it so successful and made it win the competition. What's very important is that Evening Star, the very last steam locomotive built by British Railways in 1960, had these same three features. In spite of 140 years of advance and man learning to fly, internal combustion engine being invented, all these things were never able to improve on the Stephenson's great achievement, which we see in Evening Star.
Introduced in 1954, these massive 140-ton Class 9F freight locomotives were a fitting climax to British steam locomotive design. The engine's large boiler powered no less than 10 driving wheels, resulting in excellent adhesion, which enabled the engines to haul extremely heavy loads with ease. Number 9 Treble-20 was the last steam locomotive built for British Railways, leaving Swindon Works in March 1960, and as a tribute to her place in railway history, she was named Evening Star. The fitting of polished copper pipework was complemented by the addition of brass number and nameplates and a plaque proclaiming her status. Naturally, she carries the ultimate Swindon embellishment, a copper-capped chimney. Despite the efficiency of their design, the class had a short working life. Although used regularly on passenger services, they were usually to be found at the head of heavy freight trains, a fitting tribute to the early pioneers of steam traction.
Of course, even as Evening Star was on the drawing board, the steam locomotive's days were numbered. Electric locomotives had been around for a long while, but the diesel locomotive had never seriously threatened the steam locomotive's supremacy. That was not until 1955, when this 100-ton monster appeared on the scene. The triangular configuration used in its engines gave rise to a name that became a byword for power and speed for over 20 years on the East Coast Main Line, the Deltic. These two diesel engines, of a type normally found in naval patrol boats, were shoehorned into the British loading gauge to produce a diesel locomotive of greater power than had ever been found before on Britain's railways.
When visitors come to the museum, they see a large number of locomotives and carriages, and they may think that this is the full collection, but there are some 290 vehicles in the National collection, and about 70 of these may be out on loan and not available on site. However, they may be seen at other locations throughout the country because the NRM, like many museums, believes in loaning its collections to responsible borrowers. The museum believes that every person, especially those who have never seen steam locomotives working, has the right to see, feel, hear and sense steam locomotives at work in the environment for which they were designed. By loaning locomotives to responsible outside bodies, the museum can bring this desire to fruition. Many locomotives will never operate, either because they're too historically important, or like this massive Chinese locomotive, they're simply too large for the British loading gauge. An excellent example of a locomotive that has operated successfully on preserve lines and has even been used for footplate experience courses is the XLMS Duchess of Hamilton. The NRM's voluntary support group, the Friends of the National Railway Museum, originally restored it to full working condition. Another loaned locomotive is the ex-Southern Railway King Arthur class No. 777, Sir Lamiel. This powerful and versatile locomotive has been restored to working order by the operating group, and at the end of the loan period will be returned to the museum in first-class condition. Of course, all the locomotives are impressive in their own way, but I asked Richard if he had to choose, which would be his favourite.
You ask which is my favourite locomotive, it has to be the Stirling Single, this one here, 1870, the pinnacle of engineering excellence for me, but especially important because of its juxtaposition with Hardwick here on the other side. These two locomotives actually were racing against each other in the 1890s, one up the west coast and one up the east coast, trying to get the fastest times between London and Aberdeen. They actually shortened the trains to go faster, they shortened the stops to go faster. They actually had to run a relief train behind the racing train because there were so many people that wanted to travel. There wasn't room for them all to travel on the racing train. But they went faster and faster, racing against each other, and both these locomotives were the company's best version of what they'd got to try and go faster. So here we have the engineer's machine. This is full of function rather than form. It's built to a price, it's built meanly and sparely, and there is very little actual extra decoration on it. And this locomotive, this actual locomotive, performed superb high-speed running on the racing trains. Now, if we move across to the Stirling Single, suddenly everything's different. We've got this very large driving wheel, but look at all this redundant engineering. None of it necessary for the locomotive to do its job. These beautiful radii, the domed ends, all the fancy bits on the steps. This was designed by a clergyman's son who believed that the steam locomotive was an object of great beauty, and if it looked right, it would go better. He was in fact very wrong. And the interesting bit about it is that you'll see that this locomotive has no dome on top of the boiler. There is no high point for the steam to collect in. Driving a steam locomotive is like driving a bath of water down the street. If you brake hard, the water all slops out over the taps. If you accelerate, it all comes out over the other end. What you really need is to collect the steam from above the water in a single place. And what you do is put a bump on the top of the boiler, like all the other boilers in the museum, and like Rocket had at Rain Hill. A bump on the top with a pipe up inside it collects the steam. Patrick Stirling, the clergyman's son who designed this locomotive, abhorred domes. He thought they were dreadful things, and he wouldn't have a dome on one of his locomotives. So the drivers had to drive this machine in a way that enabled them to get round the technical constraints. Here we have the form of the object is actually compromising its function. This is the antithesis of washing machine engineering. If you turn a washing machine upside down to try and change a belt, the first thing that happens is that you cut your hands on all the nasty sharp edges. The thing's designed to last the guarantee period. It's a really nasty piece of work that performs its function. This is a beautiful piece of work which was designed to last forever, but its function is compromised by it not having a dome.
Of course, there's much more to a railway than just the locomotives, and the NRM concerns itself with all aspects of railway operations. These buildings were themselves once part of the North Eastern Railway's huge operations centre here at York. This, the Great Hall, was once the North Shed, one of 3 engine sheds where 150 locomotives were checked and prepared for work every day. And the South Hall was originally a goods depot. Well, you won't find many of these on today's railways, but the turntable was once a vital part of railway operations, allowing the steam engine to turn around for the return run back to the home depot. The engine shed here at York is a fine example of the roundhouse system, where each locomotive sits on its own length of track so that it can move in and out of the engine shed without disturbing the other locos. It simply moves onto the turntable and then off up the main line. This turntable is one of the biggest. It's 70 feet long and able to take the longest of the locos. And you'd think, with all that weight on it, that it would be difficult to turn. But in fact, when the weight of the loco is evenly balanced, it's actually quite easy, especially when you have an electric motor. Well, there's one thing that the early locomotives could not cope with, and that was hauling trucks up a steep slope. To solve this problem, railway engineers turned to existing technology, and what they came up with was a stationary steam engine which pulled the trucks up the gradient by means of a rope attached around a drum. This is the Weatherhill winding engine, dating back to 1833, and for many years it was in use at the Stanhope Quarry, hauling trucks up a 1 in 12 incline on the first part of their long journey from the quarry to the rapidly expanding ironworks in the northeast of England. The machine was controlled by the engine man from this platform, and although it seems a little precarious now, he would have walked out onto it from the first floor of the engine house. Now here's something on a smaller scale. This is the museum's own model railway, and as you'd expect, it reflects the care and attention to detail you see in all of the museum's exhibits. Running automatically for 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, this superb O-gauge railway has everything. including its own pub. The museum has a large collection of models, and this brass and copper model of a Firefly-class locomotive was commissioned in 1840 by Daniel Gooch, chief engineer of the Great Western Railway, and we'll be hearing more about him later on. It's one of the finest examples of model-making craftsmanship in Victorian England. Well, it may come as some surprise to find models of ships in the National Railway Museum. But many railway companies operated shipping services, particularly on the ferry routes. This particular model was built by Thornycrofts of Southampton, who also built its full-size counterpart in 1924 to operate between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight. Well, now we've moved right up to date, and the opening of the Channel Tunnel marks a new era in Britain's railway operations. It rightly deserves its place at the National Railway Museum. Well, of course, they couldn't fit the entire tunnel in here, but this section shows how it's constructed from segmented rings of concrete. And you can also see a mock-up of a Eurostar cab. It's impressive, but not quite as impressive as the real thing. This is the library. The NRM has over 2 million books, posters, photographs and papers of all kinds that are stored here for use by researchers. Filling these shelves are many remarkable items, and some of them are so precious that they can only be handled when you're wearing cotton gloves. And I have one right here. This notebook dates back to 1840, and it once belonged to Daniel Gooch, who was only 20 when he was appointed Chief Engineer of the Great Western Railway. If you remember, it was his brass model of Firefly which we saw earlier in the South Hall. Gooch had notoriously bad handwriting, and it's suspected that the detailed drawings in this notebook were actually done by his assistants. The book gives fascinating insight into Gooch's working methods. There are one or two personal comments. For example, I see here March 1840. Well, perhaps that's best left unread. The museum's many artworks feature scenes from the early 19th century right up to the present day, reflecting the enormous impact railways have had on our way of life. The railways have also done a great deal to promote the seaside holiday and sporting occasions of all kind. This original painting formed the basis of a striking poster. It just needed the words. In the 1920s and 30s, the railways commissioned the best commercial artists of their time, and the results are truly impressive. Sir William Orpen's striking interpretation of The Night Mail, The Engine Men in 1924 contrasts with a more traditional style employed by Murray Secretan. British Railways continued the practice, and Jack Marriott's 1949 painting of Oldbury Village is a superb example of the railway's relationship with the world of art. From representations of railways in art, we turn to photographs, and this superb album dates back to 1867. It has some of the earliest photographs of navvies at work, constructing bridges, tunnels and cuttings. There are over 1 million photos at the NRM, and as you might expect in such a large collection, every format imaginable, from microdot to these very large format glass plate negatives. The NRM has such a vast collection of railway items that not all of them can go on display at once. Now, everyone's attic's full of interesting things, but just take a look at these. They're all fascinating in their own way. Each one has a story to tell, and they all have a place in railway history. And not just railway history. Some of the items in this store have had a part to play in world history. Take this, for example. I'm sitting in the chair which belonged to General Dwight D. Eisenhower from his personal railway coach in World War II. And this chair has witnessed some of the most momentous decisions to be taken in this century as Eisenhower met with Winston Churchill and other wartime leaders in 1944 to plan the final phases of the war. This is the storage area where many smaller items are kept, such as tickets, watches, lamps, flags, nameplates, in fact all the dozens of items that are required to keep a railway running. These racks hold the nameplates of steam and diesel locomotives, reminders of a vanished era. Silver Fox was one of the A4 class locomotives built by the LNER in the 1930s. The Fox symbol on the boiler represented speed, and she was sister engine to the record-breaking Mallard. There are all sorts of subjects covered by notices and signs. Restrictions on the use of toilets. Idlers are not permitted to use them. And this one here, workers will be fined 2 shillings and 6pence if they leave work before the whistle, by order. And over here, are we supposed to believe that Victorian horses were so well educated they could actually read this sign at a Camden goods depot? Building a railway commenced with cutting the first sod. And for this you need a spade, but no ordinary gardening tool. The spades were all ornately decorated and designed to be wielded by a suitable dignitary. In this case, Lady Northcote, who cut the first sod of the Exeter Tane Valley and Chagford Railway in 1884, and she was rewarded by being allowed to keep the spade. Some railways went even further and cut up the first sod as if it were a wedding cake and put it into presentation boxes for VIPs. Here's a piece of the first sod of the Hull, Barnsley and East Riding Junction and Dock Company, cut on the 15th of January 1881. From spades to walking sticks. And this beauty belonged to Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a man of immense achievements. But there's one battle he didn't win, and that was the Battle of the Gauges. The Great Western Railway broad gauge of 7 foot and a quarter inch failed in its challenge to the standard gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches. But Brunel was a practical chap, and his walking stick was designed to convert to a track gauge for his railway. Well, there's one subject that's been the butt of 1,000 jokes: railway catering. But all this is about as far away from a toasted sausage sandwich on a paper napkin as you can get. For example, take a look at this. This wonderful dinner plate comes from the company director's saloon of the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway. And just imagine eating your Danish pastry off it. Well, the railway certainly knew how to cater for their customers. The Great Western Railway provided these quart pewter tankards, although they are perhaps outmatched by this. A wonderful 3-handled punch cup from the Grand Hotel at St Pancras Station. However, nothing could surpass the elegance of this hot water samovar from a refreshment room on the Great Central Railway. Unfortunately, things don't seem quite so elegant as we move into more recent times. Silver gives way to plastic. And how many of you remember these? The infamous plastic coffee cups. Well, even they have found their way into railway history.
Alongside the main hall, visitors find the works, which is actually made up of 3 separate areas. The workshops, where major items of rolling stock are refurbished and overhauled. The working railway, where visitors get the chance to operate authentic railway equipment for themselves, and the warehouse, where the museum houses thousands of railway artifacts of all shapes and sizes.
Well, yes, I think, as usual, you know, I mean, there's always a rush.
But let's start in the workshop, where LMS Pacific Duchess of Hamilton is undergoing heavy repairs performed by the museum's team of experts. Visitors get a bird's-eye view of proceedings from the elevated gallery. This viewpoint is easily accessible either by stairs or by the inclinator. The workshop gives visitors a glimpse of the harsh reality of steam locomotive operation that lurks just beneath their gleaming exterior. Rolling stock maintenance involves a wide range of skills, including carpentry, as demonstrated by the work being performed on this LMS snowplow. Comparing the condition of some of the rolling stock in the early stages of renovation with that of an item almost complete and ready for its final coat of paint, it's not difficult to appreciate the effort required to keep the museum's exhibits in their immaculate condition. There's no shortage of gleaming paint, steel and brass in the working railway section. Designed largely to be interactive, here visitors get the chance to gain hands-on experience of railway operations with exhibits such as this mechanical signal box. A large plasma screen explains the procedure and invites visitors to get to grips with the bank of levers. As they do, the effect is faithfully reproduced on the signal box instruments, and the imaginary train's progress can be followed on the illuminated track diagram. If the real thing is more to your liking, then you can watch the movements of actual trains on the East Coast Main Line as they happen via these screens linked directly to York's computerized signal box. If you don't believe the screens, you can confirm what's really happening from the viewing balcony. This facility provides a first-class vantage point from which to view train services entering and leaving the north end of York Station. Returning to the warehouse, visitors can browse the vast range of smaller items, many with a fascinating history ready to be discovered. Here you'll find models, signs, signalling and point operating equipment, even furniture, all conveniently laid out, even the convenience itself. If you enjoyed operating the interactive signal box, you'll find the vast array of signalling equipment on view in the warehouse equally absorbing. There are mechanical systems, electro-pneumatic systems, electronic systems, an amazing collection of ingenious devices, each designed to make rail travel increasingly safe. This O-gauge model railway system was constructed in the early 1900s by the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway for use in its training school for signalmen. The operation of the points and signals faithfully reproduced signalling and safety systems of the time, allowing trainee signalmen to familiarise themselves with railway operations and working practices. The restoration of many of the smaller exhibits is entrusted to the dedicated volunteers who are experts in their field, and it's planned to eventually restore this superb model to full working order so that visitors can fully appreciate the careful interlocking of signals and points that keep the possibility of human error to an absolute minimum. Beyond the signalling equipment, the walls are adorned with a vast array of notices, nameplates and signs. And the warehouse also houses several items of rolling stock, including this example of an early Liverpool and Manchester Railway passenger coach. The gleaming name, number and maker's plates are real icons of the golden age of the railway, evoking a multitude of images and memories for the more mature visitor. There are signal box name boards, coach boards and a vast range of enamel signs so typical of their era. Amongst the larger items on display is the ornate carving that once topped the Doric arch positioned in front of Euston Station in London. Connoisseurs of railway modelling can't fail to be impressed by this superb range of fine-scale O-gauge models depicting LNWR locomotives and rolling stock. The dedicated work of just one man, John Peel Richards. Between 1944 and 1999, he made over 600 items, and at the time of its donation to the museum, his collection was listed in the Guinness Book of Records as the largest collection of models to be constructed by one person. In addition to the J.P. Richards collection, models depicting locomotives of other railway companies are also on display, and the largest model in the collection is this Bayer Garrett design built for the LMS. Impressive though it is, it's not quite as impressive as a full-size locomotive. In the main hall, alongside the record-breaking Mallard, is a train with its own speed record. When brought into operation in 1964, the Japanese railway's Shinkansen, which literally means new main line, linked Tokyo to Osaka and represented the latest in railway technology, its high-speed running heralding the dawn of a new era in rail transport. This early film shows one of the test trains which formed the basis for the prototype bullet train. To coincide with the start of the 1964 Olympic Games in Tokyo, the Shinkansen started operations on the 1st of October that year, and with great ceremony, the first train entered service. Rather than attempting to upgrade the existing rail network to handle high-speed workings, Japanese railways decided to build completely new routes for the bullet trains. A highly imaginative decision, but one which allowed the full potential of the trains to be realized. As newer versions of the bullet trains have been introduced, speeds have risen further to almost 190 miles per hour, and all of this with an unrivaled safety record. Car number 22141 entered service in 1976, one of the first generation of high-speed bullet trains, designated the O series in the Japanese Railways fleet and remaining in service until October 2000. On its withdrawal, it was offered by Japanese Railways to the National Railway Museum. Japanese Railways' generous offer was accepted, and in the summer of 2001, 22141 arrived in York, the first rail vehicle built and operated outside the UK to be taken into the National Collection. Visitors are welcome to step inside and experience the latest in rolling stock design, 1964 style, and imagine that Mount Fujiyama is flashing past the windows at 130 miles an hour. The futuristic lines of the Japanese bullet train form an interesting comparison with the Eurostar cab positioned alongside. It's amazing to think that almost 30 years separate the two designs. But let's step back a little further in time and look at some other interesting items of rolling stock.
The museum has over 300 coaches and other items of rolling stock, many of which are on display here in the South Hall, where the atmosphere of a Victorian station has been wonderfully recreated. And here we have nothing less than the very epitome of luxury travel, the Pullman coach. Topaz, built in 1913, ran on the South Eastern and Chatham Railway, and it's a superb example of the vanished age of Edwardian elegance. From the comfort of their velvet armchairs, the traveller can admire the intricate veneers and inlays, these lovely brass lamps with their silk shades, and if you're in need of refreshment, a simple touch of the button summons the attendant for afternoon tea. The Edwardian elegance of Topaz is in marked contrast to an altogether more unusual example of rail luxury that was once available to international travellers, the Wagon-Lee sleeping car. The strong continental appearance of the Wagon-Lee intrigues many visitors, and as the Eurostar has dramatically shrunk journey times, the concept of sleeping en route from London to Paris is a reminder of a more leisurely age. Although sleeping cars were commonly used throughout Britain, only these cross-channel coaches carried multilingual signs and displayed instructions on how to fit life jackets. Altogether, 18 coaches were built in 1936 for the inaugural night ferry sleeper service introduced to link London and Europe, with travellers able to retire to their beds in London and rise in Paris. The coaches reach mainland Europe on specially adapted cross-channel rail ferries sailing between Dover and Dunkirk, with the ferry shunters under instructions not to disturb the sleeping passengers. Although World War II interrupted the service, it was quickly reintroduced as continental travel became more popular with the British public. However, in the 1960s and 70s, the appeal of car and air travel rose rapidly, and in 1980, the night ferry finally ceased, bringing to an end one of Britain's most exotic and fascinating rail services. Well, this is not the kind of coach you'd expect to find your average commuter in. It's more like something out of Jules Verne. I've got Richard here to explain exactly what it is. Richard?
Well, this is called a dynamometer car, and a dynamometer car is really a mobile laboratory, and it's used to test all the different parameters that come out of a steam locomotive and to assess its performance. It looks incredibly complicated, but it's actually fairly straightforward. If we try and imagine that the coach is really a big spring balance between the engine and the train, and when the engine pulls hard on this carriage, then this giant spring that's underneath the floor drives this pen backwards. So as the engine pulls harder, so this pen moves. Now in front of us, we've got a table with rollers either side. And this piece of paper moves across the table, and the faster the train moves, the faster the paper moves. If the train goes 10 times as fast, the paper goes 10 times as fast. And all the various measurements that are taken on the locomotive are recorded on this paper. Mm-hmm. That might sound very complicated, but really what it means is that if you're going to go for a record, what you need to do is to have the proof that you've got the record. It's no good coming back and saying, I've just done 126 miles an hour with the steam locomotive. So what you've got to do is to prove it, and this piece of paper, because it's travelling at a known speed, proves the speed that the locomotive ran at. The technicians who worked in here were able to communicate with the staff on the footplate, the driver and fireman and the inspector, via the microphone which is here and the loudspeaker which is above our heads. It was very difficult to make conversation sensible in here because there'd be a lot of noise at high speed. In 1938, nobody was supposed to be going for the record. It was a bad time. Britain was getting ready for World War II, and Germany had just got the record at 125 miles an hour. Only the driver, Joe Duddington, and the fireman, Tommy Bray, really knew what was going to happen. And they'd prepared the engine, which was 5 months old, at its prime. The engine was, if it had been 5 hours old, it would have been tight. If it had been 5 years old, it would have been slack, but 5 months old, perfect. And gradually the speed climbed, and as they chased down Stoke Bank and got to a place called Little Bytham on the 3rd of July 1938, that's when the 126 miles an hour was recorded. And of course everybody then said, well, isn't it marvellous? But before then, this vehicle, which, remember that it was built in just at the turn of the century. They were running on track that wasn't like the modern welded track now. It was bouncing around, the crockery was falling out of the cupboards. It must have been really exciting and very exhilarating for the people involved.
And this is the actual locomotive which broke the world record on that momentous day in 1938. Mallard was one of 35 A4 class locomotives constructed by the London and North Eastern Railway's Doncaster Works and designed by their chief mechanical engineer, Sir Nigel Gresley. The futuristic streamlined casing captured the public's imagination, and from their introduction in 1935, the class proved to be an outstanding success, allowing the acceleration of express services to Leeds and Edinburgh. When Mallard entered service in 1938, the A4s had become established as the racehorses of the East Coast Main Line, regularly reaching speeds of over 100 miles per hour with apparent ease. The early summer of 1938 saw regular test trains powered by the A4s, but on Sunday the 3rd of July that year, Sir Nigel Gresley had another test in mind. On the return journey to London, Grantham was passed at a leisurely 24 miles per hour, but within 10 minutes, Mallard's phenomenal acceleration had whisked her 240-ton train to over 100 miles per hour. With her huge driving wheels revolving at an incredible 8 times per second, Mallard roared down Stoke Bank, setting a world record for steam traction that is unbroken to this day, 126 miles per hour. In 1948, commemorative plaques were fitted to Mallard's streamlined casing, detailing her achievements in attaining the highest recorded speed for a steam locomotive. Finally, in April 1963, after covering almost 1.5 million miles, Mallard was withdrawn from service. But her unique place in railway history guaranteed her survival, and her restoration to the original garter blue livery is a fitting tribute to the world's fastest steam locomotive.
This is another specialist vehicle, Lucy. This is a post office on wheels, and this was used by the railway to deliver mail. This vehicle is 1883, and the way it all works is shown beautifully in the film Night Mail. But what was really happening is that the people who were sorting were sitting at these desks, going through the bags of mail that they'd got from the terminus and sorting them out into their various destinations. When all the mail was sorted, it was put into sacks, bound up into these big, heavy parcels, and then, as the train was still going along non-stop, was hung out the side of the train, and a net at the side of the track collected it. That wasn't the end of the story, though, because also hanging at the side of the track were other towns' mail hanging out, ready for this train to collect. So the process went on all the way through the journey, and it was so complicated that, in fact, there were things like mail for Ireland was still being sorted as the trains were going up to Scotland and dropped off part way up the journey so it could go across to Ireland. So the whole process saved time and caused the Royal Mail to be delivered much faster than it would have been by just sorting it at the end and then putting it on the train.
From the pure functionality of the travelling post office, let's move just a little bit more upmarket. Well, no matter how luxurious first-class travel claims to be, nothing can compare with the special saloons built for our kings and queens. These fabulous palaces on wheels are one of the most popular items here at the NRM, and it's pretty obvious to see why. Now, normally, members of the public aren't allowed to enter these vehicles, but today I'm fortunate in having special permission to show you inside. As we saw earlier in the library, great care is taken to protect the museum's unique exhibits, so anyone who enters the royal coaches must wear these protective overshoes. This is the special saloon used by Queen Adelaide, widow of King William IV, on the London-Birmingham Railway in the early 1840s. Not the sort of thing you'd see at Euston today. This delightful four-wheeled vehicle is the oldest with royal associations anywhere in the world. It's actually 3 separate compartments, which very much reflect the stagecoach design that railway carriages were based on at that time. Right here we have a special observation compartment. This is the day compartment, and at the back here is the sleeping compartment. Well, by day, this is a normal compartment. Very comfortable it is too. But when Queen Adelaide wanted to take a royal nap, all she had to do was to convert these two seats to get a full-length bed. You see here, the back of this seat actually lifts up and can be fastened safely into position. And then you slide your legs inside to a special compartment built on the end of the coach. And usually these compartments were used for storing the royal mail, but in this coach it's for Queen Adelaide's feet. This coach last saw service in 1847 and was immediately preserved for posterity. Queen Victoria was the first reigning monarch to travel by train in 1842, and this saloon was originally built as two smaller coaches by the London and North Western Railway in 1869. It was linked by a flexible gangway, which the Queen refused to use when the train was in motion. When the train was modernised in 1895, because Queen Victoria was so fond of the two coaches, the railway companies, eager to please, agreed that the two could be combined together into one unit, and you can still see where the joint is. OK, so now let's take a look inside and see what it's like. These interiors remain exactly as they were in November 1900, shortly before Queen Victoria died, and they were designed at the height of Victorian exuberance. Just take a look at the decor. The watered silk decorations here are in patriotic colours of red, white and blue. Hurrah for the Empire! Well, in 1895, when the carriages were modernised, electric lighting was installed, as well as these buzzers to summon the attendants. Queen Victoria was very suspicious of this newfangled electricity, and she insisted that the oil lamps be retained. This is the Queen's toilet compartment, and as you can see, its decoration matches that of the day compartment, with the blue damask and brocade. And of course, only Queen Victoria was to use these facilities. The attendants and ladies in waiting had to use their own. Well, this is the Queen's sleeping compartment, and as you can see, there are two beds, because she was often accompanied on her rail journeys by her daughters, Princess Helena and Louise, or by her granddaughter, Princess Victoria, and they considered it a great honour to travel this way. At the end of the carriage is this compartment, decorated in gold silk, and it's here that the ladies in waiting would relax until summoned to attend the Queen by a large electric bell. King Edward VII didn't want to use the vehicles built for his mother, so he had no less than 3 new royal trains constructed by various railway companies. And these two coaches were built for the King and his Queen by the London and North Western Railway in 1902. And they're regarded by many as the finest example of railway carriage building ever achieved in Britain. So let's take a look inside. Well, here in the Queen's saloon, isn't it lovely? The walls are finished off with white enamel. The furniture is satin wood inlaid with ivory, and all the upholstery is in various shades of green, as is the carpet. And the green colour scheme is softened by the pelmeted and tasselled curtains around the room. The saloon is fitted with electric lights, a 3-speed pivoting fan, and a bank of electric control by the door. Fans, lights, and of course 2 bells for summoning your attendants and ladies in waiting. These royal saloons were the first to be fitted with a bathroom. The original bathrooms were fitted in 1915 with silver-plated baths, and then in 1941 these were replaced with the ceramic baths that you see here. This was so that the King and Queen could travel the country in relative comfort, sometimes for days on end. Look at the red line. Tradition has it that this was a wartime economy measure, a 5-inch water depth, but it's equally likely that it's the safe filling depth for a bath in a moving train so that water doesn't slosh out onto the carpet. The King and Queen saloons are very similar in layout and furnishings, with both having their own bathroom and bedrooms that are bright and spacious. The white wall finishes help to create the impression of space within the carriages, an impression that is enhanced by the fine furniture provided by Waring of London, who also furnished the 1893 Royal Yacht Britannia. In the King's sitting room are a comfortable settee, armchairs, and his writing desk, and who knows what important letters were penned here. The telephone could be used within the train at any time and was connected to a landline when the train was at rest. The refinement of a radio was added in 1935, with speakers and volume controls positioned at appropriate places in each compartment. The King's day saloon and bedroom are slightly smaller than those provided for the Queen. This was as a result of the creation of a smoking compartment at the end of the King's saloon. Well, I'm now in the King's smoking saloon, and the sombre colours show it's a little different from the Queen's saloon. And it was here, to his green leather armchair, that the King retreated after dinner to enjoy a brandy and cigar, the compartment being equipped with sockets for the King's own electric cigar lighter. With their air of magnificent opulence, it's easy to see why the royal coaches are an irresistible attraction for many visitors. However, the smooth passage of even royal trains, not to mention the hundreds of commuter and express trains, goods and work trains which ran daily on the railway, depended on 1,001 everyday items, which, although they're frequently ignored or hidden from view, were crucial to the railway's efficient operation. Fortunately, at the end of their working life, many of these items found their way into the fascinating mosaic of railway history that is the National Railway Museum. Well, I've spent a complete day here, and I feel I've hardly scratched the surface of the fascinating world of railways. In my imagination, I've journeyed through 150 years of history. I've travelled under the Channel and over the highest moorland. I've driven mighty steam engines and sat with royalty. Where else could I have done this than at the National Railway Museum? Let's come back again soon.